Good afternoon. I'm writing a book of essays about inequality and poverty in Singapore at the moment. And what I want to share today is the introductory chapter. And I'm a little bit nervous about talking about it. I present it with some trepidation because I'm not sure it's what you signed up to hear. And also it's still a little rough at the edges. But I think that on the issue of poverty and inequality, that this work that I'm doing now really needs to be situated in broader conversations with people who are invested in social change. So if you're here today on a Saturday afternoon, I presume you're invested in social change in some way. So I present this to you, and I look forward to your questions and your comments. Yeah. Can I have the first slide, please? Second slide. When I think about my research, a memory that often returns and which evokes complicated feelings is an image of myself driving away from the blocks of HDB rental flats where I do my field work. I've done this countless times. Got into my car at the end of a few hours of hanging out at various field sites, turned on the ignition, taken a sip of water from my water bottle, and driven home. Home is a comfortable apartment, barely a half an hour away, a world apart. When I get in the car, I'm usually still thinking of the people I just met, recalling the stories they've shared. Sometimes I'm feeling sweaty from walking around for a few hours. If the topic of bed bugs had come up, I feel phantom itches on my arms and legs. As I start driving, I transpose myself back into a radically different reality, one where my profession brings me status and recognition, where I can easily say to my family, oh, I'm too tired to cook tonight, let's go out. Where I can walk into any shop, museum, restaurant, and be greeted as a potential consumer. It's a reality that fits into the image of Singapore as global city, and I, its global citizen. Footloose, cosmopolitan, mobile. The first time I drove away was after a focus group discussion in which the women involved charted for me their movements through space on an average week. It looks something like this. Next, I guess one step ahead of me. No, before that. Yeah, as you can see, I will probably need a graphic designer for my book, but you get the point. That afternoon, after the focus group discussion, as my car entered the highway, it dawned on me that what was for me just another drive, a journey I could take whenever I wanted, that I do in fact take whenever I want, was for the people I had just met, an irregular occurrence, It was, to be honest, a surprising revelation. When I speak with people who are not from Singapore, one of the things that comes up is how small it is, how it is just an island. And I often perpetuate this truism myself when I describe Singapore to friends who have not been here. You know, Singapore is very small, it's just an island. Yet here I was, meeting people for whom the island is in fact large and rarely explored beyond a few must-go places. While people in my social circle go wherever they wish on a regular basis and complain about running out of things to do on weekends, I was meeting people whose experiences of space in Singapore is limited to a radius of a few kilometers. If they traveled longer distances, it was to get from home to work and back home, and not necessarily to use any of the leisure or consumption spaces that I'm familiar with. And soon after this initial visit, I would meet numerous other people who have lived in Singapore their whole lives, and yet not been to many of the places that I give little second thought to. Next slide, please. Mobility and immobility are at once spatial and temporal. They are about movement through places, and also changes over time. Mobility and immobility are lived realities as well as imagined states of being. So they describe our everyday movements, and they shape how we think about where we have been and where we can still go. When I present my work on poverty in contemporary Singapore, I sometimes encounter audience members who respond to what I say about material hardships by launching into stories about the hardships they grew up with. So at one workshop, I talked about a woman whose family was homeless for a few months. Her children had to shower in public bathrooms at 4 a.m. every day because they were living at the park. So before going to school, in preparation for school, they will wake up very early, take cold showers in the public bathrooms. And as I spoke, a man in his 70s quipped that he takes cold showers every day too. And he cheerfully pointed out that it's nice because the weather in Singapore is so hot. At another event, I talked about bed bugs. I talked about bed bugs keeping up children at night, keeping kids up at night, leading them to miss school when they overslept in the morning. Another man in his 60s talked about how he experienced bed bugs as a child too. Now, the remarks were made partly in jest, but their speakers aimed to soften the impact of my claims. What they were essentially implying is that taking cold showers is not so difficult, and bed bugs are not such a hardship. But of course they are. What these two people imply are quirky habits or everyday phenomena of a romantic past are, for the people I've been meeting these recent years, uncomfortable conditions of an everyday present. It is their everyday reality to see that everyone else appears to have moved up and established some semblance of comfort, while they alone are left behind. When the two men spoke of their hardships, it is rendered legible by a specific narrative, meaning we understand what it means and where it places because we have a certain narrative. Each year, more material is produced to bolster this narrative. More exhibits, more posters, more movies, more declarations and slogans on websites, more news articles. Layers of a story build on each other, strengthening its overall structure, brightening its common sense veneer. For a Singaporean, even a critical-minded one, it is a story that gets under the skin. It is a story that seeps into one's emotions and becomes so deeply a part of a story of the self that it is hard to externalize and articulate. This is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves. Singapore became, in a matter of a few decades, a shining global city. We were poor, and now we are rich. We had no natural resources, and now we can eat whatever we want, buy whatever we want, right in our own city. We were uneducated, and now our children are among the highest scorers in the world on standardized tests. We are safe, we are clean, we are amazing. We are amazing. We're amazing. To remain amazing, we must keep moving. Movement, motion, mobility. These are not cosmetic. These are about survival. If we stand still, we are doomed. How does this narrative matter? When the two people listening to my talk brought up their hardships, it is this narrative, so taken for granted it does not need uttering. It is this narrative that renders their experiences dignified rather than shameful. One can proudly talk about taking cold showers because one knows that one is accepted to have climbed and arrived. One can recall bed bugs fondly rather than with shame because one is assured that one has moved up and is beyond the dark days of being poor. With the national narrative of miraculous progress serving as backdrop to their personal stories, these men can lay claims to a kind of dignified triumph. Which then leaves us wondering, what about the dignity of those who have not been and are not mobile? What about those who have, within this structure of this narrative, stood still? Inequality is now widely recognized as a problem in Singapore and in other wealthy cities and countries. Although equality has been, in some ways, a small blip in history, the aspirations to equality are strong. and the persistence of inequality feels like unfinished business. Mass education and large-scale nationalist rhetoric around new nation states, including the promise of greater well-being for all, has rendered equality a promise many of us continue to long for. The state of global inequality is bleak. Tremendous inequality remains between nations. It may no longer be trendy to talk about imperialism and colonialisms, but the legacies of the monopolization of resources by the global north to the detriment of the well-being of people in the global south, these remain contemporary realities. Inequality within societies, too, looks bad. The exploitation and monopolization of resources plays out as inequalities between classes of people. So, where some own abundant cash and capital, many find themselves in more precarious situations, yet others seem altogether out of the game. In cities, where most people now live, we see manifestations of this in the contrast between skyscrapers and slums, in the contrast between shopping malls and ghettoized migrant worker dormitories, in the contrast between the bodies of people laboring as maids and construction workers and those who work out at gyms. The point of saying that we have problems that can be situated in a global world is to point out that we don't need to think we are exceptions who have nothing to learn from others. I won't go into the income trends in Singapore today because we have two economists here who can speak to that in more precise terms. I'll just say that the people I've been talking to in the past 3 years are at the bottom of the income spectrum. These are households that qualify for HDB rental housing. By definition, this means that they earn $1,500 or less per household per month. While their situations may be particularly difficult, what they struggle with, I think, can help us understand some general challenges and insecurities faced by people in the contemporary global city. So the point of looking closely at their lives is to shed light not just on the very low income, but to use their experiences as a way of understanding our systems and our values more broadly. So earlier, I talked about the notion of narratives, about upward mobility, about wealth, about how amazing we are. Now let me zoom in on to look at how this narrative is given further shape. The system that is in place for the selection and sorting of persons in Singapore is often referred to as meritocracy. What are the contours of meritocracy? First, upward mobility is something individuals can achieve. This is a modern sensibility in its implication that one's fortunes can be detached from one's family's fortunes. Second, mobility can be achieved through hard work within the formal education system. This is in contrast to a model of success through business and enterprise that was the dominant mode before mass education. Third, the formal education system is strongly focused on academic know-how and examination that tests these. Fourth, while hard work is a necessary ingredient, an element of success is also about natural abilities. While everyone has a shot at success, there is already some natural inequality among people, and the system cannot correct those natural inequalities of intelligence and talent. Instead, what the system does is to sort, to select, to weed out, and then to differentially reward students based on examination results. An aspect of the script of meritocracy that is rarely commented on, but widely accepted, is therefore this. The system aspires to fair competition, but the outcomes of competition are inevitably unequal positions in terms of academic credentials, professions, income, and wealth. In other words, although no political leader anywhere would emphasize this in the terms I'm about to, dreams about meritocracy have never and do not pretend to lead to equal outcomes. Inequality, in fact, is a logical outcome of meritocracy. So what the education system does, when it selects, when it sorts, when it hierarchizes, and when it gives its stamp of approval to those at the top, is that it renders those who succeed through the system as legitimately deserving. In tandem with that, those at the bottom have failed to be deserving. Through the discourse and institutionalization of meritocracy, the narrative of large-scale upward mobility is thereby made concrete at the individual level. So the connection between national success and individual merit is a powerful public and private narrative. It shapes those who've arrived, those in motion, and those standing still. So to return to the two people who talked about cold showers and bed bugs, we could say that the national narrative of mobility is powerfully grafted onto their individual narratives of worth. Okay? So the national narrative of mobility matches onto their individual narratives of worth. Okay? This is me being anointed as meritorious. On the afternoons and evenings when I conduct my fieldwork, as I visit families to chat, I sometimes get the feeling that time slows down. I walk into flats and I see ways of being that I recognize from my own childhood school holidays in the 1980s when I would spend time at my grandparents' house in semi-rural Malaysia. I met a man who was boiling water on the stove so that his child can have warm water to scoop out from a bucket to clean himself. Tilams are kept away, stacked to one side during the day, and laid out on floors at night because the space for sleep is also the space for living. There's actually a lot that is positive in what I've observed. Some of it is reminiscent of a time when relationships between people felt deeper and more central to the rhythms of everyday life. We sit on floors, chatting about the past, about the present, taking our time to build trust and understanding. Without a huge rush toward narrow goals and quantifiable ends. People, in fact, have a lot to do. They're very busy. But they somehow still have the patience and the generosity to put their tasks on hold in order to entertain my questions. This, I would point out, is actually a huge contrast to my earlier work when I interviewed mostly middle-class respondents. So I find myself viewing my normal rhythms as a university professor and working parent in fresh light. I recognize a profound neglect of humanity in the mad rush that dominates my regular social interactions. In my field site, I also often see children as young as 6 who are capable of caring for siblings and neighbors who are young and who are younger than them. They all run around the corridor playing games. And their independence, their capacity for care, make me mildly irritated when I return to my own middle-class child. It takes a while to move beyond seeing these scenes as either those of a romantic past or an impoverished present. They are neither and yet both. What they represent is something that requires a different set of vocabulary, a different set of lenses to view clearly. These lives can be seen clearly only when I zoom out, when I situate where these flats are in the wider terrain of the city, when I view the kids relative to their peers in Singapore schools. Most importantly, I can see them clearly only when I suspend my internal narrative of Singapore and my own biography of third world to first, lower class to higher. I can see them clearly when I force myself to see both the pitfalls and the strengths of all circumstances, not just theirs, but also mine. And I can see them clearly only when I invert the naturalized hierarchy that structures our interactions. That I, a professor, is automatically superior to them, who are cleaners, cashiers, drivers, laborers. When I suspend that, and when I honestly ask, what are the pitfalls of their circumstances? What are their strengths? What are the pitfalls of my circumstances? What are my weaknesses? What do the contrasts in our circumstances and the ways of being tell us about the systems in which we find ourselves navigating decisions and building lives? When we pose these questions, we are saying that the problems at stake here are not just about them, but also about us. We disrupt the tendency to use the higher income, higher educated as the norm against which people are measured. We cast aspersions on the standard aspirations for credentials, for status, for wealth, for rankings that are so regularly prescribed as universal and beyond question. The point here is this: numerous qualities and values which we presume to be good are not neutral and universal. To me, it's crucial to think about and articulate this point repeatedly. The discussion of third world to first, lower class to higher, presumes that a certain type of change is good and that the changes we have experienced are necessary. So that in discussions about poverty, even among well-meaning people, there is an underlying presumption that the lower incomes ways are inferior, their choices are bad, their cultures are problematic, and that the appropriate intervention is to get them to behave more like us. And there is insufficient attention to the fact that reward and punishment systems are not neutral. Not all qualities, skills, capacities are equally valued in our society. Not enough thought is given to the ways in which some of us set the standards against which others are measured. So being able to sit still, take instruction from adults, spell English words accurately, even when they make no phonetic sense. These are crucial for success from day one in primary one. And they are qualities that the wealthier among us spend money to cultivate in children. Stepping back, there is very little we can say to defend their inherent value. So there's little we can say to defend the inherent value of being able to sit still and spell butterfly at primary one. Okay. On the other hand, the generosity of neighbors, the capacity of children to do household chores and care for siblings, the mutual dependence within extended families who show support for one another, these values that I see in abundance among low-income communities are not values that are actively promoted. In our system of rewards, they do not translate into assets that lead to either material or symbolic upward flights of families and individuals. So in our national narrative, these are not values that are legible, especially not when they are embodied by the lower income. When we insist that some behaviors should be rewarded, that is often because we have vested interests, rather than because those qualities have inherent human worth. In a city whose story to itself and to the outside world is one of rapid upward mobility, the people I've been meeting over the past few years are framed as left behind. More importantly, since mobility is cast as an individual endeavor, they are also marked as losers in the game, unable to keep up. And they're often stuck in these positions by a confluence of educational credentials that don't open doors, jobs that are poorly paid, and care gaps that are not adequately addressed. And so it is that we have not one city, but multiple cities. For people like myself, the city is full of promise: entertainment, safety, solid infrastructure, security, mobility. For the low income, it is a city of limited movement. Their lives are characterized by physical hardship and a strong sense that they will go nowhere. So the qualities that they and their children have, of resilience, of independence, of generosity, these have little legitimacy and standing in this shiny global city. The most common critique about meritocracy in Singapore is that it is not working as it should, that our problem is not with the principles embedded in the system, but with implementation. Hence, 1,000,001 tweaks to level up. In the sociological literature, meritocracy is widely recognized as a system for sorting and for legitimizing, for legitimation of that process and outcomes of sorting. It is a system for sorting, selecting, and then differentially rewarding and not rewarding people. And it relies on narrow notions, narrow understandings of what is worth rewarding and what is not. And meritocracy works well when there is what the late French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu referred to as misrecognition. Misrecognition. And misrecognition happens when we think that a system is based on a certain set of principles when it really is based on another set of principles. So when we think it rewards each individual's hard work, when in reality it rewards economic and cultural capital passed on from parents to children. When there is misrecognition of the real principles and mechanisms of rewards, it's a system that legitimizes who ends up its victors, casting them as individuals who have succeeded on their own hard work and intelligence rather than on any inherited unfair systematic advantages. It's also a system that tells us a specific story about failures, casting those two as individual lacks, individual failings, rather than systematic disadvantages. So, from a sociologist's point of view, meritocracy in Singapore is working exactly as it can. It's working exactly as it can. And it works very well in convincing us that we all, no matter where we are on the social hierarchy, deserve to be exactly where we are. Those who cannot get their children to have qualities that are recognized and legible as merit pay its price. And as inequality across society intensifies, we see that this is a price paid not just by the very low income, but also for people higher on the income spectrum, who recognize and fear that there is a lot to lose, even if in a little bit of downward mobility. So the tuition industry, the enrichment business, depression and anxiety among youth, the high degree of stress experienced by parents, the time wasted supervising homework, these are costs to people higher on the spectrum. Now, although this is not something I dwell on today, I think these two are worth reflecting on, that meritocracy has a price for everyone, in fact, on that spectrum. Individuals do not live on islands, even when we literally do. We are connected through rich and complex and intricate ties to others in society. What we do and do not do are shaped by our sense of how others are. Shared understandings of right and wrong, shared understandings of good and bad, shared understandings of valuable and worthless. The pathways and the practices we take are made meaningful by shared scripts and shared narratives that permeate our society. So it is our shared scripts and shared narratives that I come to have a strong sense of myself as a professor, and some of the respondents I meet come to have an inferior sense of themselves as cleaners. The everyday experiences we have of how people look at us, talk to us, treat us, invite or don't invite us to partake in social life, these are the materials we draw on to craft ourselves. So when my PhD, My educational credentials open doors and opportunities when in every email that I get from strangers, I'm addressed as Prof. When students call me Prof when they see me, when I'm given merit increments annually, this adds not just to my material wealth, but to my sense of self-esteem. When a low-income person goes to the social service office and is asked numerous personal questions about their family lives, asked to show numerous documents to prove their worth, asked about how $40 appeared on their bank account statement, asked about why don't you just go get a better paying job? This too adds to their sense of themselves as inferior, unworthy, excluded. Inequality is often studied as an objective fact, as a question of numbers. It is of course that. But the numbers are derivative. They are drawn from patterns of social realities, but they don't fully describe the realities themselves. Inequality as a social phenomenon is very importantly experiential. We experience it. It is a lived reality. It is felt in everyone's everyday lives. These lived experiences tell us important things about how inequality is enacted and every day reproduced. So as a sociologist, I'm interested in structure. What that means is that I'm interested in how institutions, rules, regulations shape what individuals can and cannot do. But the structural is not deterministic, meaning it does not drive its own history. It's not absolute, right, in determining people's pathways. Structural circumstances provide the scaffolding, but it is persons going through their everyday business who enact daily practices. And it is in these daily practices that we can understand the effects of the structures. My research, which I started about 3 years ago, began as one of poverty, of the low income. I really thought about it in those terms primarily. It's a project about the low income, about the poor, about them. But over time, I've come to realize that the story I have uncovered is one of inequality, of relative wealth and poverty. It is a story about us. Quite frankly, it would be easier to write a book about poverty and to continue thinking about the problems and issues at hand as one that can be resolved by attention to them. But I think it would be less honest, and it would be poorer and less complete knowledge. And why does this knowledge matter? Because how we see a problem, the questions we ask about a problem, shape the kinds of solutions we come up with. So if we misrecognize our problem, we can't be surprised when we cannot come up with solutions to solve them. The study of poverty is not rocket science. What there is to know about it isn't so difficult to understand. The study of poverty is not rocket science. What keeps us from understanding and appreciating it is not its empirical or theoretical complexity. Now, I say this not to say that there's no research to be done. There's a lot. And I have every vested interest to say there's a lot of research to be done because I'm only mid-career. There's a lot of research I want to do. Yeah? I say this because I often hear people say the problem is complex. And then I wait in vain for the rest of the sentence and it never comes. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's complex, but really it's not so complex that it's beyond our understanding. Why am I inserting myself so much in what I write? This is not typical practice in academic writing. I've never shown a slide of myself getting a degree in a talk. It's actually tremendously uncomfortable, personally. But I insert myself because as I get deeper and deeper into this research, I see that this is key to shifting our lens for viewing inequality and poverty more fully. The biggest barrier to understanding and to appreciating inequality and poverty is in some ways myself, or rather my social position and where I place in the Singapore narrative. The big barrier to accepting the realities, the contours, the experiences, the undeniable realness of poverty and inequality in Singapore, the barrier is ideological. And it is an ideological barrier that we share as a collective. It is an ideological barrier deeply embedded in our national narrative. So the biggest barrier for understanding poverty and inequality for people with varying degrees of power, status, influence is our vested material and symbolic interest in its perpetuation. We are so deeply implicated in our national and individual narratives of growth, development, and meritocracy that we have trouble confronting and seeing stories that trouble these narratives. Narratives are not bad things. We need to tell ourselves stories about ourselves in order to understand our past, make meaning of our present, aspire to the future. The problem I'm highlighting today is of an overly monolithic and singular narrative. When narratives are monolithic and singular, they become essentially fortresses of vested interests, biases, and blind spots. To see better, we need to expand our narratives. We need to scrutinize our biases and our vested interests. We need to work harder to reduce our blind spots. What does this mean for what we're doing here this afternoon? What we need to do when it comes to understanding poverty and inequality has to go beyond tracking statistical trends and describing the contours of hardship. Yeah? So I'm describing here, that yes, it's important to do the statistical trends, the quantitative work. It's important to do, what I'm doing, I want to say, tracking the contours of hardship. Of course it's important. But I think uncovering more data alone is insufficient. The big challenge we face as we do this is in changing the narrative, our national narrative and our internal biographical narratives. If we can do that, if we can face up to how we are all implicated, if we can face up to how we are all entangled, if we can confront how the narrative we hold on to upholds our own privileges at the same time that it maintains the disadvantages of some of our fellow residents in this country, then we can really start talking about solutions. When we shift the narrative, how would we approach differently? We would not ghettoize the problem of poverty. We would not think about it as a problem of the other. We would not think there are those who render help and those who receive help. We would not think only in those terms. We would talk about wealth every time we talk about poverty. We would insist that elitism and marginality are two sides of the same coin. We would stop being so coy in speaking about exploitation and about the exercise of power in everyday lives. And we would start to deal with the really uncomfortable truth that when those of us with more do things that are the best for our children, that we are also further solidifying the narrow definitions of merit and creating less space for children who have other qualities that are not legible in our system. I think when we shift the narrative, we would also not shy away from calling this a moral problem, an ethical issue. Importantly, we would look at our systems more broadly: education and so-called meritocracy, welfare and so-called dependence. We would examine all of these, and we would think about how these need to shift in profound ways rather than repeatedly tweaked at the edges. Poverty is not rocket science. Step one is to disrupt the narrative. Thank you.